everyone. Welcome to another inspiring session of the Youth Engagement Forum. Today, I'm very honored to be speaking with Dr. William DePaolo, who is recently appointed an associate professor of medicine at the University of Washington Medical Center and is the recipient of the Lynn M. and Michael D. Garvey Endowed Chair in Gastroenterology. And Dr. DePaolo is also named Director of the Center for Microbiome Sciences and Therapeutics, CMIS Labs, which really serves as a place for research and for the community interested in the human microbiome. So thank you so much, Dr. DePaolo, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So your field, learning about the microbiome is just so fascinating, and I'm sure that our readers would love to hear from you on this. So please tell us about CMIS Labs at the University of Washington and about your role.
Okay. So the Center for Microbiome Sciences and Therapeutics has happened due to a generous gift from a donor whose family member came down or started suffering from inflammatory bowel disease. And so when they were looking around at how different treatment options and different avenues of research, they realized that the microbiome was becoming more and more popular and that there really wasn't a centralized facility or a centralized center on campus at University of Washington. So they donated money to start the center and to hire a director of the center, which is myself. And we basically, the center is here to act as a sort of a beacon for all the researchers at the university that are working on the microbiome that didn't have a place to go or other faculty to ask questions or bounce ideas off of to come together. So I'm in charge of doing programming and getting seminars and speakers and originally finding all of these faculty that are spread throughout all of the different university campuses and trying to bring them together. So it's been a big role, but it's been fun, and it's been really interesting to learn what everybody's doing at CMIST. And one other thing I just want to highlight is that we are not only here for the university, but we're also here for the community. And so we really try to do a lot as far as giving out correct and usable information to the public, because science can be difficult to understand for most people. And I think sometimes scientists can use words that other people don't understand and forget that other people don't understand it. And so we really try to use different avenues of art and literature and things like that to try to educate the public and reach out to the community.
Yes, thank you. It's really great to hear about how your work is community-based and how as CMIS Labs, you're also involved in engaging with the community and answering questions. It's very fascinating, as I said before, to hear about the microbiome and all the different work that you're involved in at CMIST. So I would now like to rewind a little bit and ask you about your childhood. So please tell us where you were born, a little bit about your family, and what your aspirations were as a kid.
Yeah. So I was born in Portland, Maine, which is the other side of the country from Washington. And I was born, so my grandparents actually came over from Italy, and we lived next door to my grandparents. So it was like one big giant house, and my grandfather owned a pizzeria and a convenience store. And so I grew up in the kitchen making pizza and making pasta with my grandparents, and we lived right on the ocean. And so everything you think about Maine is true. There's lighthouses everywhere. I'd go out lobstering on the weekends with my dad's friends, and fishing and all that stuff, like playing in tidal pools along the ocean. So I really grew up in sort of an idealistic sort of childhood that was great. And being outside and looking at those, exploring the tidal pools and all this, I've always loved science. And more than that, I always have asked a lot of questions, and I'm never satisfied with any answers usually. And so, and I also talk a lot, and I talked a lot, even more as a child. So those sort of traits all, I think, added up to making me who I am today, which is, science is all about asking questions and really not getting the answer that you expect and asking more questions and things like that. So yeah, and my aspirations, I never thought that I would ever be working on poop. That was something that has been quite different for me. Like, you don't grow up saying I'm going to have my life studying other people's poop or the gut microbiome at the time, but I always wanted to help people, and I always wanted to do something that meant something to the community. And so I think that, I've designed CMIS in a way that I can still have those sort of goals.
Yes, thank you. It's fascinating to hear about your journey to being part of CMIS. So please tell us about your college journey and about how you became involved with the microbiome.
So I went to a small liberal arts school in Maine. It's called Bates College. And there I became, I was trying to decide between English and being an English major or being a science major. And I took a class on neuropharmacology that was extremely interesting. And then I was sold on the neuroscience. So I was a neuroscience undergraduate major. And I worked for the summers there. I got my first laboratory experience at Bates in a laboratory that worked on periodontal disease. And so they were studying the bacteria that cause cavities. And so that was my first time in a lab, and I loved it. I lived up there for the summer, and I just threw myself into the research. And then the next summer, I went to Memorial Sloan Kettering, which is a cancer center in New York City, to work on immune therapies that they were using to treat and fight cancer. And so I got to work in the lab, and I got to go to the clinics, and I got to meet the patients, and then I get to take their samples and I get to study them in the lab. And so I kind of got a really good view of science, both the clinical and the basic side of science. And I decided that I didn't like the clinical side, and that I was really much more interested in the research and the questions and that. And so that college experience really made me decide to go to graduate school. And I pursued a PhD at Northwestern University in Chicago. And I got my PhD in immunology and microbial pathogenesis, where after that, I went to the University of Chicago, where I worked on bubonic plague. And why I ended up working on bubonic plague was 9/11 had just happened right as I was getting my PhD. And I had known all the stuff about the immune system. I understood all the different cells and all the different organs, but I didn't understand the bacterial part of things. And so after 9/11, there was all this talk about bioterrorism and bioweapons. And I wanted to, use that time to really try to understand the bugs. So I went and I started working on Yersinia pestis, which is a bacteria that causes bubonic plague. So sort of like the epidemic that we're in right now. Imagine this occurring way back in the 13th century, where you had very little water, very little sanitation. Nobody had masks to wear. Nobody had Purell for their hands. And so imagine how quickly a pandemic would spread in that sort of population. And that's what happened with plague. So we were studying how that bacteria was so deadly. And I ended up getting stuck by plague in the facility where we infect the animals. So there was an accidental needle stick. The person I was working with dropped a needle and it went into my wrist. And, so then all of a sudden I had a little freak out because I just infected myself with bubonic plague. But I got to the emergency room and they did take care of me eventually. And I didn't have any symptoms, but that made me think a little bit about what I wanted to do with the future of my life. And so I decided to get away from the sort of deadly infectious diseases and start working on gut bacteria. And so there's some different infectious diseases that cause diarrhea. And so I started working on those. Diarrhea is a little bit more safe than plague. And so that's how I ended up in the gut. And then I was working on the gut bacteria before it was called the microbiome. So I was sort of pre the fad of the microbiome. And all of a sudden, when the microbiome hit, I was kind of swept away with that and labeled as a microbiome researcher. And there I've just kind of sat and I've just kind of created my career around that. So that's how I ended up working on the microbiome.
Wow, it's really fascinating to hear about your journey and all the amazing research projects that you were involved in. So to many of us, the word research, when we think of research, to most of us, young people, it means working in a lab with mice. Is that really true? And why is research so important in medicine?
Yeah, so I think that that's a common misperception about a misconception about research. There's actually, I say we can talk about three different types of research really. So there's bench or basic science research, which is what you're discussing right now with the mice in the lab. And then that gives, so basic science kind of gives a groundwork for something called translational science, which is when you can take your findings in the lab and you start applying it to human cells and human tissues. And then the last sort of science or research is clinical research, which is where you're applying cures and treatments to a patient population. So you progress from basic all the way through a clinical sort of progression. And nowadays, you don't always have to do mouse work. Science is now big data, and data science is a huge part of my research now, and a lot of research out there. So for people who don't want to work with animals, there's all sorts of alternative systems to mouse work, or other animal research, but also data science and bioinformatics is also a huge part of research. So I think those are science and research now is much more encompassing, and so it's exciting to see how all of this, and the microbiome has really pushed sort of data science to the front of the visibility, I think, because of all the data that we get from that. And research is important in medicine because everything, as you can see with what's happening with this COVID-19 and the vaccine efforts, you have to have the research there. You have to show safety and efficacy, and that these things are going to work. And you have to do that in model systems that are not people. So you have to try to identify systems that can give you an answer, and then you can apply that to a person to make sure that the vaccine or whatever you're studying is safe and effective. So research sort of is there for us to develop these therapies and to understand how they work and to what makes people sick and how to fix them in a nutshell, I think.
Yes, thank you. This gives us great insight into what research is and how research works. And more than that, the different types of research that we can be involved in. And like you mentioned, the microbiome, it's so fascinating, and it's really something that's emerging as something that is where scientists are beginning to find out more about, and just so fascinating to see how it affects so many different parts of our body. So please tell us, our readers, about the microbiome and why is everyone suddenly talking about probiotics? So why should we be concerned about the bacteria in our gut?
Yeah, so we have 100 trillion microorganisms living on us and inside of us, and this is what's called the microbiome. And so when we talk about the microbiome, we're not only talking about bacteria, we're talking about viruses and protists and fungus as well. So all of these sort of microorganisms are living on our skin and in our digestive tract. And we found recently, in the last 10 years, that the microbiome contributes a huge amount to our health. So not only is it important for our development and our growth as children growing into adults, but it also helps with our immune system. And it teaches our immune system how to be to activate against certain things and to be quiet and calm and tolerant of other parts of our body. We found a lot of mental connections between the nervous system and the gut, and so people started to look and see that during different disease states, your gut changes. And so I think that this is what really brought microbiome to the forefront, is that, the idea that when somebody, we all have a healthy microbiome, right? So our microbiomes are all these organisms that live inside of us. So each one of us has a microbiome, and our microbiomes are completely different from each other. So everybody's microbiome is like a snowflake or a fingerprint. So you can almost tell people apart by the bacteria that are in their gut. And so everybody's got this unique microbiome, but it doesn't necessarily stay the same. So if you think about all of the bad things we do to our bodies, like when we're stressed out and we're anxious and we get the upset stomach, or when we get sick and we want to take antibiotics to like kill whatever is making us sick, or we decide that we're gonna like binge eat McDonald's for 10 days. And these sort of things all affect our gut, and they all affect the microbiome in different ways. And there's all these different bacteria there that some are going to love that high fat diet, some are going to hate it, and the ones that hate it are going to probably shrink and be kind of shoved out by the ones that enjoy the high fat diet and can use that fat as growth and to be able to grow and expand. And so when you do this enough, when you perturb your system enough, when you hit it with so many insults over and over again, eventually you get to a point where it changes and it shifts. And that's called a dysbiosis. And a dysbiosis of the microbiome is what is, when people talk about that, what they're saying is that you have a normal microbiome and then you have something that's not what you started with. So it's a change from what your healthy sort of physiology has. And this dysbiosis has been associated with a number of different diseases. And so when people were looking at the microbiome of people who had inflammatory bowel disease versus healthy, they saw other bacteria were much more abundant than certain other species. And so this started to clue us in that the microbiome could be used as a first, like you could tell if somebody's sick by the different abundances of the bacteria. And second, could we manipulate the microbiome and turn it back into its healthy state? And so one of the ways to do that is through introducing something called probiotics. And probiotics are these sort of good, healthy bacteria that have beneficial effects to the taker. And so when you take your probiotic, it's thought that these probiotics will help transiently, or sometimes like they'll either colonize the gut or they'll sometimes just pass through, but even passing through, they have an effect that's healthy. And they will fight off that bad bacteria that has sort of grown and taken over. And so probiotics were actually very popular about 10 years ago, I think, like right before the microbiome hit the press, but people were studying probiotics and they were looking at them in a lot of clinical trials, but these clinical trials failed. And they didn't do well because people were using all the different types of probiotics. They weren't standardizing it. And so probiotics went away for a long time, and then the microbiome came. And so people started revisiting the probiotics, and that's why you're hearing a lot about it, because now people realize that they weren't taking into account the microbiome. They were only looking at the probiotic. They weren't seeing this interaction between the probiotic and the microbiome. And so the reason that you're getting that sort of, a lot of people talking about probiotics is because they think it's a good way to combat the bad things that they're doing to their microbiome and to restore a healthy gut. And so people always are looking for like a cure for things like that. They have a damaged gut, so how can they fix it? And so probiotics is one way that can be done. So and so basically, we need to worry about our gut bacteria because these guys they've been with us since birth. So these bacteria have been with us since birth, and we're actually just as much bacteria as we are human cells. So we have 100 trillion bacteria in our bodies, and we are made up of about 100 trillion cells. And so when you look at their DNA, there's 200 times more bacterial DNA in our bodies than our own human DNA. So we really need to be concerned about these bugs because they contribute a huge amount to our physiology and our genetic makeup, everything. So, and that's why I think the microbiome has become such a buzzword, is because of these sort of effects that we just still don't even know like what it can do. We're just at the brink of figuring these things out.
Wow, that's really fascinating. One thing that really surprised me was just to learn how many of these bacteria live in us, and just to learn that we have as many of these bacteria as we have cells in our bodies. So I think this just gives us great insight into why it's so important to keep our microbiome healthy, because they make up such a large part of us.
Right, exactly. I mean, I've heard us described as just sacks of skin, and the bacteria are basically controlling us because of the connections to the gut and our immune system and all of that. So they're very, very important, and we're realizing that now, and so that's why there's so much buzz around the microbiome.
So, Dr. DePaolo, what are some of the things that we as teenagers can do, or things that we can avoid in terms of diet and lifestyle to help protect our microbiome? And you were mentioning dysbiosis earlier. So, what are some of the things we could do to prevent that and to keep our microbiome healthy now that we know just how important it is to make sure that we're maintaining a healthy and diverse microbiome?
Right. So, and that's key, is to maintain a diverse microbiome. So not only do you have a lot of different like bacteria there, the different types of bacteria are important. So it doesn't matter if you have 10 of the same type, you want to have 10 different types that are there because it's how they interact together. And so something I think that I remember back from when I was a teenager is something easy that can be done, or maybe not so easy, is sleep. I think that sleep is very important. Taking care of yourself, eating your vegetables, avoiding excess sugar, and sort of maintaining trying to have as less of a stressful life as possible. So we know that um, the microbiome has circadian rhythms, and so the microbiome that you wake up with is different than the microbiome that you go to bed with. It changes throughout the day, and so if you don't sleep, if you don't allow your body to rest, if you don't enter those cycles and then to get that deep sleep, that's going to have an effect on your bacteria, and your bacteria will get stressed. Just like you get stressed, bacteria can get stressed too. And so sleep is a good way to make sure that you restore, the microbiome, and that has a chance to recuperate from all the stuff that you've done to it during the day. And then I just go back to just doing what your grandparents or your mom says, which is eat your vegetables and avoid eating a lot of sugar and avoiding sugary sweetened beverages and things like that. Because really the high fat diet and the sugary beverages of the Western world have really altered our microbiomes greatly. So like when you're sucking down those Mountain Dews, or like the high energy drinks to keep you up studying your studies at night because you have a test the next day, that is affecting your microbiome, because it's directly affecting it because you're taking it in through your digestive tract, and we don't know exactly what that does yet because there haven't been studies on it, but I'm sure that it changes their, if it doesn't destroy some of them, it changes what they're doing, and I think that that's a bad thing. And something else I think is good to highlight, especially for people who want to start dieting, because I know dieting is a big thing maybe in teen years, is that fad diets and crash diets are really bad for your microbiome. This is sort of the honey lemon iced tea, or you put the water with lemon and cayenne pepper. It's a detox, I guess. So there have been studies where people have done that, and they showed that those individuals have a completely different microbiome even after they stop doing the detox. Their microbiome takes like a month to get back to normal, even after just 3 days of doing that detox. So remember that when you deplete your body of nutrients, or you give it something that it's never had before, you're going to shift your microbiome. And the field is so young, we don't understand what exactly it's going, like we don't understand a lot about the microbiome right now. We're still scratching the surface. And so there's a lot of questions that we don't know. And so how long does it take for a microbiome to come back to normal? Will it ever come back to normal? How do different diets affect it? I think are very important questions that we still don't know. So I think for teenagers, I think just sleep, like decrease your stress as much as possible, and healthy eating as much as you can. And I think that will set you up for a good microbiome.
Well, I think it's just so amazing to hear how literally everything we do affects our microbiome. And often we as teenagers wonder, what do our parents mean when they're telling us to eat our vegetables? And why is it so important? But this gives us all a great input as to how we can keep our microbiome healthy, and what are the things that we do in our day-to-day lives that can completely change our microbiome. So, Dr. DePaolo, what role does our microbiome play in our immunity and in our mental health?
Yeah, so that's a big question. But if you think about, so the gut is a huge organ. It's your small intestine and your large intestine. And so you may think that your gut is just there to absorb nutrients and for the food you don't to pass through, but actually the gut is our largest immune organ in our body. So there's more immune cells in our gut tissue than anywhere else in our body. So if you think about it, we have your gut cells, your intestinal cells, and then you have this huge immune system. And then right on the other side of that, you have 100 trillion microbes. And so what's the immune system very good at? It's good at detecting and sensing people or things that are not us, foreign invaders like microbes. And so you can imagine the delicate balance that has to happen, because your immune system is there ready to attack a bacteria that breaches the gut, but then you have 100 trillion bacteria right on the other side of these cells. And so there's a lot of specialized tissues and a lot of things in place to keep those bacteria from getting into our intestinal cells in the gut wall. What ends up happening is when you have a dysbiosis, some people will, after a high fat diet or when you're sick and you have chemotherapy or things like this, the barrier between the immune system and the gut bacteria becomes weakened. And sometimes you can get bacteria that are healthy gut bacteria, but they translocate and the immune system senses that. And when the immune system senses that, it doesn't realize that this is a good bacteria that's in your gut. It just says this is a bacteria, and it sends out the alert signals, and you start to get inflammation. And inflammation is sort of good in a small dose when it's there to get rid of an infection. But when you have 100 trillion bacteria that can keep hitting the immune system, you can get chronic inflammation, and that can lead to diseases like colorectal cancer or inflammatory bowel disease. And so because of that, delicate balance, that's another reason why we have to maintain a healthy gut, because we don't want dysbiosis to occur. We don't want that immune system to be activated by our healthy gut bacteria. We want to save that activation for when we need it, which is when we have a salmonella infection or we eat bad food or something like that. And so, that's just one example of how the microbiome and the immune system sort of interact. There's a huge number of ways that the microbiome plays in our immunity. It helps to tolerize our immune system at the beginning during our childhood, and it functions to keep bad bacteria away. So if you think about, if you're a bad bacteria that's from a bad taco, a fish taco or something, and it wants to get into our cells, well, you have to get through all that thick layer of bacteria to get to our cells. And so the microbiome actually even is a barrier defense against bad pathogenic infectious bacteria. So in that sense, the microbiome and the immune system are always going to be linked, and they're very tightly linked together. So there's a huge amount of research going into studying this sort of interplay between the immune system and the microbiome, especially because of the number of diseases that occur when the immune system gets turned on unexpectedly. As far as mental health goes, so when you're doing something you enjoy and you have that feel like you feel really good and you're happy and you have a smile on your face, that's caused by a neurotransmitter called serotonin. And serotonin is, you would think that it's produced by your brain because it's a neurotransmitter, but actually 90% of the serotonin in our body is made by our gut. And it's made by our gut in a way. So what happens is these probiotic bacteria like lactobacillus, which is a probiotic, it will create chemicals that tell our gut cells to produce serotonin. So when you have a good, healthy amount of lactobacillus and a good, healthy amount of probiotics in your gut, you have lots of serotonin that's being produced, and that will stimulate yourself to be happy and to be not depressed. Now, if you have a dysbiosis that occurs because, again, you're very stressed or you're taking antibiotics too much, you reduce your lactobacilli. What's going to happen? That means you're going to reduce your serotonin levels. And so that means that you're going to feel less happy and you're going to feel a little bit more depressed and you're going to be sluggish and maybe not want to get out of bed in the morning and all this. And that's because you're in a way, because you've decreased your gut bacteria, the good guys that are there to promote this. So, and that's just one example of how gut bacteria and can help and affect our mental health just through that, like preventing depression. And so, one area of study that people are doing is to look at and take people who are depressed and to give them probiotics and to see if it helps ameliorate their depression. And we're still waiting to hear about those results back and things like that. But there's a lot of interest in modulating the gut to make you feel better. So there, again, it's the mind-gut connection is as strong as the immune-gut connection.
Yes, thank you so much. I think that's why it's so important to just be aware of the significance of these trillions of bacteria that share a symbiotic relationship with us. And when we're aware of that, we can know what things we can do to keep our microbiome diverse and healthy. And just being aware that it impacts our mental health and our immunity in so many areas that scientists are still exploring. And this research into the microbiome is just so intriguing. So we read a lot about fermented foods like yogurt, kombucha, and What if some teenagers don't think they're cool? What could we do instead?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So I think, fermented foods are great. So I'm not going to say that they're not, because they're great. It's a great source of probiotic bacteria. That's better than, I think, taking a supplement. So, when we talk about fermented foods, what we're talking about are these like kombucha and sauerkraut and kimchi, where the process of making these foods allows a type of bacteria to grow and to become very abundant. And usually it's a lactobacillus. So it's the sort of bacteria that helps promote mental health and helps protect our immune systems and all that. And so if you don't want to eat fermented foods, if you really think it's uncool and you don't want to do it, I guess one alternative is to take these sort of probiotic supplements in these capsules. Now, I think the benefit of a fermented food is that, so we have probiotics, but there's also something called prebiotics. And prebiotics are not so much the bacteria themselves, but it's the things that feed the bacteria. So when you eat fermented foods, you're also the kimchi and the cabbage and the stuff that's made from, that actually is feeding your gut bacteria that you already have. So fermented foods do like a two-hit. First, they start feeding any good bacteria you already have. And the second hit is that they're introducing good bacteria that's in the food. So I think that, the best thing to do is to eat your fermented foods. And if maybe enough people start eating it, then it will be cool. But I think that these are definitely foods that people should keep on their radar and try to eat them as much as possible. There's also new things on the horizon, like nutraceuticals and all these sort of lactoceuticals. And these are going to be engineered bacteria that have their genes manipulated so that they can get in and they colonize us and they can do certain things. And so if you want to be a real trendsetter and you want to sort of wait around for these sort of engineered probiotics, then maybe that's the alternative. But for right now, I think pretty much it's the fermented foods if you want to do this, if you want to really restore your gut health and keep it healthy.
Yes, it's great to know about the different ways that we can incorporate these fermented foods in our diet, and there's so many benefits that they provide to our microbiome. And it's just really fascinating to see how so much research and so many studies are being done into this. And I'm sure that in coming years, we'll know a lot more about the impact of different kinds of foods on the microbiome. Can you please talk to us a little bit about the impact of smoking or vaping on gut flora?
Mhm. Yeah, there's not a lot of research done on this topic, but actually this past year, in I think February, at New York University, NYU, they did a study where they compared the bacteria in people's mouths who vaped or used e-cigarettes versus smokers versus non-smokers, and they found that the vapors, or the people who vape, have the same sort of gut bacteria or the mouth bacteria as the cigarette smokers. So it's really affecting the bacteria in your mouth greatly. And so what they're seeing is that in people who vape, there's an increase in the number of bacteria that cause cavities, specifically a bacteria called Porphyromonas gingivalis, which is a pretty bad guy for creating and giving cavities to individuals. So in addition to seeing that sort of dysbiosis, because that's an oral dysbiosis, they also saw increase in inflammation. So these people had, the vape users had inflamed gums and like the early signs of inflammation in their oral cavity, similar to cigarette users. So even though it might be beneficial to vape in some ways, it's, I think, still giving sort of a negative effect as far as the bacteria in your oral cavity.
Yes, it's really important to know how dysbiosis can occur in so many different ways, and it can impact so many different parts of our body. And just it's so also really fascinating to see how different bacteria perform so many different functions in our body, and we wouldn't be able to survive without them. Dr. DePaolo, please tell us about the latest research that is happening in terms of the microbiome and how it is relevant to emerging infectious diseases. And I know that there's a lot of new research going on. So hopefully you can tell us a little bit about the emerging research and its impact on the infectious disease field as well.
Yeah, so I think that right now, obviously with COVID as an emerging infectious disease, I think there's a lot of eyes on the microbiome. And so I think as far, so there's a lot of groups out there looking at the microbiome and using it as ways, you can see it in two different ways, sort of. But you can use studies where you have patient samples before COVID and patient samples from after COVID. And so what they can do is they can go back and they can see if you got a bad infection with COVID now, what was your microbiome before COVID even hit the United States? And by doing that, they can start to narrow it down to see if there's a sort of, if you have a sort of bacterial predisposition to having a worse infection. So can we predict that somebody will suffer from COVID very badly based upon their microbiome? So I think that's one area of research that we'll see a lot of segue and a lot of people doing work in that field. The other one is to look at the microbiomes of people who are already infected and to see if you can manipulate that to help their infections, right? So can you change their microbiome and will that have an effect on disease? And so these are areas, of course, like the pandemic has just hit this year. So a lot of this research we won't know for years and years. But I think people are, because the microbiome has been so forefront for so long, people were so smart when this pandemic happened and they started, when patients were coming in, they started saving stool samples and saving different oral spit samples and things like that, so that now they have freezers full of samples that they can go back and they can study how, different fact, like this person has these genetics, how does it affect COVID, how does it affect your microbiome? So I think the idea that we were able to start thinking better about how to plan for microbiome studies is really something that helped and will help the field, because now we know how you have to store stool, how you have to prep it, and to even take the samples in the first place, which a lot of times in the past people weren't thinking to take a fecal sample when somebody comes in with depression. But now we know that there could be something learned from that, so we're doing that. And so as far as the COVID-19 and microbiome goes, I think we're still at such early stages, it's hard to see where it goes. And I think we also have to realize that the microbiome is still at its infancy, and we still don't know a lot about even some basic concepts about the microbiome. Like we are forgetting that we don't know how long a dysbiosis lasts, and like, does it come back to normal every time? And like, how many times do you perturb a system before it's changed? I think we still need to understand these sort of simple questions before we start applying this to too big of something where we don't understand the virus at all. So COVID-19 is still kind of a black box. So you have the microbiome, which we don't understand, and then you have a virus that we don't understand. And I think that it's going to be tricky to come up with good questions. But as far as other emerging infectious diseases go, I mean, I think there's a really big push to look at how the microbiome affects vaccination efforts, especially in countries where they're dealing with typhoid and rotaviral infections and Shigella infections and things like that, where they have vaccines for these, but they're not working very well in third world countries. And so to understand, is the microbiome somehow causing this, or can we boost the microbiome and boost vaccine efforts? I think that's like something that is really important to understand in the future, especially because of some of the results of the other vaccines that are out there. And then, our lab specifically, what we're kind of working on as far as less about emerging diseases, but more about sort of the interaction of nutrition and how different nutritional components really affect the microbiome. So when you eat, when you take an omega-3 supplement, like a fish oil supplement, how is that affecting your microbiome, and like how does it affect each different type of bacteria in your gut microbiome? And we're really starting to think more about the bacteria and less about the human. So bacteria, I'm all about bacterial stress right now, and so I think that bacteria get stressed just like we do, but their response is very different, but it's detrimental to their health. And so we're starting to kind of look at that, and that plays out into not just infectious disease, but into dieting and health and things like that. So I think, the microbiome right now, I could give 10 hours of lecture on how the microbiome and what research is happening. So I think we, I think there's always something new coming out with the microbiome. We just have to sift through it to make sure that it's good research and that it's sound, and that that we start really applying rigorous methods to understanding and analyzing data and things like that. So, as far as I think we're still at those. I think we're still just scratching the surface. We're going to learn a lot more in the next 10 years about the microbiome, and with tools that we don't even know exist yet. So I think that there's a lot of stuff going on that will be very exciting.
Yes, wow, this is just so amazing how there's so many different fields within the microbiome research. There's microbiome and immunity, microbiome and mental health. And now it's great to see, and it's so inspiring to see how scientists are doing work with the microbiome and COVID. And like you said, Dr. DePaolo, I really can't wait to see what emerges next in this field and what comes up next and what we find out and learn about how the microbiome influences different aspects of our health. So lastly, please tell us about your other interests. I know you like hiking and climbing, and do you ever feel like mountains and microbiome ever overlap, and what do these interests have in common?
Okay. Yeah, so I think moving up here to the Pacific Northwest, I really enjoy being outside, whether it's being in my yard and gardening or landscaping, and or paddle boarding out on the lakes. I'm not a big climber, but I did climb Mount Kilimanjaro a few years ago, which was exciting. And visiting Africa, I love traveling and I love Africa. Africa's definitely a place that I go back to every few years. And Kilimanjaro was a really special experience that I think when I was thinking about your question and I was thinking about it, I think there are a lot of similarities between mountains and the microbiome. So this might be a little long, but so I think when you start climbing a mountain, you have no idea what things you'll come across or just how high you'll go. And so in the microbiome, I think what everybody is different and we don't know who or what we'll come across when we do our research. And so there are 100 trillion microbes, and that we've even yet to start studying some of the bugs, like really get into the viruses and the fungus and fungi. In mountains, like as you go higher, the topography changes, and also that means that the different species of birds and animals will change. Just like in the gut, as you travel through the gut, the topography will change, and that changes the types and species of bacteria that are present in the gut tissue. And so as you go deeper, higher up a mountain, there's less oxygen, and deeper into the gut, there's less oxygen. So you start to have to change, like you breathe differently when you're climbing a mountain, you have to walk differently. And the bacteria that live in these low oxygen areas have to function differently, right? And then I think that, once you get to the top of the mountain, when you look back down and you see everything you've climbed and you just know where you're like, that you have nowhere else to go, that you've reached the peak, I think it's a great feeling. And so I think with the microbiome, as we start to uncover more and more, we're going to have that feeling of like solving questions and answers. And then the last thing I wanted to say is that the depressing part about climbing Kilimanjaro was that I got to see the glaciers on the top, but they're melting, and they're like severely melting. So they probably won't be here in 10 more years. So the glaciers will all be gone on the top of the mountain. And that's due to climate change and urbanization. And I think if you think about that and you think about urbanization and the sort of rise of fast foods around the world and how it's affected obesity around the world, which affects our gut microbiome, you can say that both urbanization and has a role in sort of destroying some of these pure, like really beautiful ecological places on these mountains, but also destroying our pure ecological niches of our gut as well. So I think those are my little sort of symbolic similarities between the two, but there's definitely there's similarities.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. DePaolo. I never knew about the similarities between two very different fields. And thank you so much joining us today. It was just so great to hear from you about the microbiome and how it impacts so many different fields, and how we really have a whole world inside of us that scientists are just beginning to explore. And like I said before, I can't wait to see what advancements come up in this field and what new research will be done in future years. And I'm sure that that will have a huge impact on the entire scientific field. So thank you so much, Dr. DePaolo.
Thank you. Thank you for having